Welcome everybody. My name is Wolfgang Arschner. I'm here at the law school. Welcome to the University of Ottawa. We are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and we are very delighted that you made it despite the bad weather, but it's clearing up, and I hope you appreciate a bit the view now that the colors are changing outside. Today's panel is a little bit different than announced because we are unfortunately missing one of our speakers, Professor Jason Garrett, who is an economist here at the University of Ottawa, is unfortunately unwell, and so he cannot join us. But fortunately, we have two terrific speakers, and I'm sure we will be able to dive into many issues nevertheless. Let me say just a couple of things about today and then introduce the speakers. So today's events on the emerging Canadian critical mineral diplomacy is really the kickoff of a three-year project that was financed by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. It's a partnership development grant. That means we are trying to bring together not only academics, but also representatives of think tanks, of industry, and of government. And as part of that project, we want to study Canada's critical mineral diplomacy, and that really means three things as part of the project, although I think we still have to work out exactly what we want to be looking at in more detail. That's why we're doing a workshop tomorrow. But in general, we are interested in three dimensions. The first one relates to Canada's unilateral trade and investment measures to, on the one hand, diversify away from China, as we'll hear, its market concentration, the upstream mining, but also the processing of many of the critical minerals that studies part of the project. At the same time, Canada also wants to establish itself the reliable partner for real supply chains. We are blessed with many resources that we hope to get out of the ground in order to apply the rest of the world. Just starting with intro, so don't hesitate to take a here. So first, the unilateral measures, both on the defensive side, thinking about economic security, diversifying away from China, but also more on the offensive side, how to become a reliable partner in supplying the world. We're also interested, and that's a core part of the project, how we can work together with others. Some of the things we can do alone, but many of the things will require partners. On the one hand, partners, our allies, both allies, NATO allies, in order to build up a common market that can sustain a thriving, but also secure, reliable critical mineral industry from upstream, stream, but also to work more with developing countries where many of the critical minerals are located, and sometimes where Canadian mining companies are present. And we want to study how the Canadian government can support their activities there. And finally, and that's more of a soft power transnational dimension, how Canada, as a proud mining country with a lot of tradition, with a lot of knowledge in mining, a lot of events and expertise, concentrated, how we can leverage that soft power in order to establish Canada as this reliable partner in critical mineral supply chains. So that's a little bit the project. Today we'll kick this off with this first reflection on where we are, and perhaps also to talk a little bit about where we should be going. And so with that, let me introduce our two speakers. So I'll start maybe on my far right, Professor Pascale Rassou is a professor here in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. She is an expert on China, just having published a wonderful book on China's vulnerability paradox, teasing out that while we think of China often as this dominant player with foresight and with years of advanced industrial planning, China has also a lot of vulnerabilities, and it's this interplay that makes it so interesting. So I highly recommend the book. Pascale has also practical experience. She has advised trade, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and has played a vital role in Canada's development of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And so she's extremely knowledgeable. She really goes into the weeds, looking at different commodity trading platforms and really trying to understand things from the ground up. So we are very fortunate to have her. And then we have to my right, Dr. Exner-Pirot, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, among her many other very impressive affiliations, also a senior advisor to the Business Canada. And Heather also brings vast experience both in the Arctic, both in relation to government and indigenous affairs, and of course, and that's why we are here, the resource sector and critical minerals. And both of them, just last week, have written short pieces exactly on today's topic. And in many ways, they nicely complement each other. So hopefully we can provide some of those early insights as we go forward. The way that we thought we would do this is first set at the stage. Minerals, I mean, we hear about it in the news all the time, but what does it really mean? What makes something a critical mineral? And then to think a little bit more about what's going on in the world. Why is that an issue that we should care about? And then in the second half of the discussion, we'll pivot and think more about Canada, to what extent our current developments are a threat to our national economic security, and to what extent is this actually an opportunity that Canada could seize. So let's get going. I think we'll talk maybe 40 minutes or so on the panel, and then we hope to involve every one of you. We have very knowledgeable experts here in the room, so I'm sure that we'll have a very interesting back and forth. All right, so let me kick this off with, well, maybe I will start with Heather. So critical minerals, why are they so critical?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Let's talk about critical minerals. I know we both don't need to say what are critical minerals, but if you're new to this field, what I'll start with saying is critical is a political distinction. It is not a geological distinction. And so it is governments that decide what are critical minerals. And I'll also start by saying sometimes rare earth elements and critical minerals are conflated. All rare earth elements are critical minerals, but not all critical minerals are rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are a particular set of elements on the periodic table. They aren't particularly rare, but they're very hard to process, and China has become excellent at processing them, and everyone else finds it hard to compete. And I think why we've conflated it politically is because kind of the first wave of trade restrictions or weaponizing critical minerals was elements, where China was threatening Japan to not export rare earth elements. Japan needs it very much for its economy. You need it for high-tech things. And so that's the first time where around 2008, 2010, where we thought, oh, maybe it isn't good that one country, in particular that country, has a monopoly on those things. But we since expanded it and talked more about critical minerals, I would say, in 2019. So under the first Trump, before Biden, very much continued, not a lot of light of day between Trump and Biden administrations on the issue. And then it was about availability of supply for energy. And we used, 100+ million barrels of oil a day. And there was a sense that we wanted to get off that very quickly. You can't, if you're getting off 100 million barrels of oil a day, you have to move to something. And that something is minerals. And so then you start to think, okay, if we want to get down 10 million, if we want to get down 20 million, that's electricity, that's copper, that's aluminum, that's solar panels, that's, all of the silver, it's windmills, it's the rare earths, it's, everything that you need to build up that electricity, and also batteries, obviously. And batteries is nickel and lithium. That's why we started talking about lithium. And so after 2019, I would say it was about energy transition, and in particular battery metals was the ones that we were really concerned with. And then I'll finish off so that Pascal can have something to add here. But I would say in the last 2 years is when we started talking about shortage of battery minerals to shortage of defense minerals and defense metals and materials. And so now the conversation in 2025 is very much about the defense supply chain. And that is where China has, obviously things are tenser since Russia invaded Ukraine. Obviously, we are seeing the world much more a competitive, adversarial kind of a dynamic. We don't want to be reliant. I think we were a bit more, easygoing with China, but now it seems very much a great power conflict. And they have put a lot of export restrictions. Trump coming in with tariffs has accelerated this, but they have put on a series of export restrictions on particular critical minerals in the last 2 years, and often ones that are very important for the defense supply chain or components. Sometimes it's not just the raw product, but sometimes it's the component. As an example, things that you need to make drones. US's largest drone maker, they put an export restriction on components. That means they can't produce enough batteries. If they can't produce enough batteries, they can't supply Ukraine with all the drones that Ukraine needs to combat Russia. So we have seen it definitely raise into the level of, traditional security, high security, hard power. And now maybe 15 years too late, we're trying to scramble for a response.
Start with this optimistic thing.
No, I mean, this is a great introduction. I would just say, lay something over what Heather has laid out very nicely already. That in the West, we come off of decades of looking at resource procurement and resource security from a sort of market-led, whereas China has looked at resource security and resource procurement from a security or resource security lens. And this has been the case, right, for forever, really. We go back to China is very resource insecure, and is at the heart of why it has devoted, decades into building areas of strength and dominance. And so, in the West, we have come to seeing resources through a security lens only very, very recently. And so we are scrambling a little bit. And we also don't have the sort of political economy sort of instincts and perhaps even the tools to respond to that challenge in a very clear and coherent way. And so you see this across the West. We've seen the critical mineral strategies being unrolled, everywhere from the UK to Canada in 2022, but, in the US also. We also have in Europe, the Critical Raw Materials Act that came out last year. And I would say that, so all these strategies turn around the notion of criticality. As I mentioned, this is full definition. It's not a scientific one. And so most countries are trying to grapple with this mixture of supply and demand elements and constraints. And so on the demand side, the fact that these minerals are to various extent related to either critical technologies or critical defense industries or the battery, the energy transition. And then on the supply side, whether these minerals are either supply constrained globally, because we foresee an imbalance in supply and demand, or whether they are too concentrated in terms of their supply sources, most of the time in China, but also, increasingly in a couple of different countries like Indonesia for nickel. And so, for example, Canada has a list of 34 minerals with 6 that are considered a priority. The US has different lists, 54 if you listen to USGS, but different lists from the Department of Energy and Defense. The Chinese government has identified 24 in its 2016 strategy. So all this to say that it varies a lot, and China and the West have adopted different approaches until very recently.
Yeah, so I want to get into some of the economic security concerns, the weaponization in a second, but just to properly understand this ecosystem. So there are different lists. Some of them are more important for defense purposes. Some of them are maybe more important for the battery supply chain. One thing I think that would be helpful to discuss really briefly is some of the differences between some of these minerals, because although they are all lumped together, actually talking about copper and talking about rare earths is really talking about sort of apples, comparing apples to oranges. So I don't know who of you wants to say just a little bit.
You can start next. But great question to give you, so in Canada, we will consider helium and potash and uranium critical minerals. Those obviously we don't have scarcity with those. Sometimes it's lobbying. I think they're important, but sometimes it's lobbying from particular groups that want to be on the list so that they can get particular tax benefits or tax incentives. We say, oh, if you're a critical mineral, you get, a kind of different flow through shares or different tax incentives. So everyone wants to be on that list. Even gold wants to be on that list. And I can make a case for gold being on that list, actually. It's very important to our economy, but it's not important to supply chains. It mostly goes into bricks, into vaults. So it is political. And for a long time, copper wasn't on the USGS list, for example. And it's because they just considered that they had a pretty good steady supply of copper from Chile. Like that particular thing was not a threat. But if you're worried about security of energy security supply, then copper is very important, because if you're going to do all these data centers and all this electrification, you can't do it without copper. And we're starting to see, for example, grades decline on copper and less investment in copper, and it's getting much more expensive to produce. So it is a little bit political of what gets on which lists. But to your point, it varies by country. Europe's has raw materials. In Canada, they're almost all elements. But in Europe, they're much more focused on materials. Again, that's the difference between an exporter, I think, and an importer. They include, for example, metallurgical coal as a critical raw material. Whereas I think in Canada, to designate coal, is something that should get tax incentives. Well, that would be a political heavy lift, even though we're a great producer of low GHG metallurgical coal. But I just want to point your two more lists that I think are of interest. One is NATO. NATO just last December put out its raw material list. And so things that it thinks we need for the defense supply chain. And this is where it gets very strategic and why it's important. The top threat, I would say, if you're in DC, Ottawa, maybe, for sure DC, is to think that what happens if China wants to invade Taiwan? And what happens to our supply chains in that scenario? And we are not, we just saw the disruption it caused with Russia, and we are far more dependent on China for key, things for our industrial base. And so how do you prepare for the situation where China invades Taiwan? And how do we protect ourselves from that? And if you did have a war with China, now a pure competitor, you feel, who will win a war of attrition? If it goes on for 2 years, 3 years, 7 years, who will win? Who will be able to keep producing ships? Who will keep producing munitions? Who will keep producing tanks? And we see this is what's happening in Europe right now. Let's see, who will produce more, NATO or Russia? Who can keep going? Who will get exhausted first? And you have to say that in the case of China, if it happened today, China would outlast. Our defense industrial base is not comparable. And they produce about, if you didn't know, Alex would know this, probably about 100 times more ship tonnage than the United States. China produces 100 times more ship tonnage a year than the United States. So if you're having a war by sea and you're shooting a couple boats every week, well, eventually the American boats run out. So that's where it becomes so critical. So NATO puts out this raw material list to say, what is it we need for the defense supply chain to make sure we have enough weapons and all these things. The other thing that I thought was interesting, maybe you've seen it, I haven't seen it everywhere, but I saw that China's list was divided into scarcity and advantage minerals, which is such an interesting mindset. For us, it's just, these are important. China divided a list into ones that it has an advantage with, and which became basically the export restriction list, and ones in which it faces scarcity, ones in which it feels vulnerable, and therefore needs to create, this kind of vertically oriented supply chain around the world.
Yeah, excellent points. I would just say, I think we have some work to do in terms of thinking about these different with more granularity. So Canada hasn't done it, but the EU hasn't quite done it either. When you look at the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, it's one of the only, if you can't call it a strategy, but one of the only initiatives in that space that actually tried to put a number on resilience objectives, right? So they've said, for example, that the EU should not be more than 65% dependent on one source. And I think the sort of objective is 2030 or 2035, 2030, I think. And those have been called, actually, by the way, overly ambitious by a lot of the expert community. But so 65% dependence on one supplier, 10% reliance on domestic production. Those are like the ambitious objectives, let me remind you. And so, if, in a situation where the European Union would be able to achieve those objectives, it could still be 90% dependent on imports, 65% of which could come from China, right? So what I want to highlight is two things here. Is one, I'll get to sort of unwrapping a little bit more the China dominance reality, but the initial point that I want to make is that 65%, 10%, those numbers are sort of bit large for critical minerals in general, and I think that that's not helpful, right? It's not sufficiently granular. And as Wolfgang said, in the question, and Heather went on to answer, we can't think about germanium in the same way that we think about copper. And we should be already able to explain in pretty plain language, think about our resilience objectives and positionality differently. It seems so obvious to me, and I'm a bit in awe that we haven't yet reached that stage where we're able to speak about battery minerals and or electrification minerals and defense-related minerals and speak about resilience objectives in very different ways. And I'm not, this is part of what I'm hoping to do in the project we're part of. I want to say a couple things on the China dominance question, because I think in the past, as you said, Heather, 2 to 5 years, the Western economies have started to grapple with this issue with a lot of intensity, including south of the border, right, with more than 5, executive orders on critical minerals or another. It seems, I think that the sentiment is a little bit more, is a little too, I don't want to sort of mischaracterize the overall sentiment, but maybe a little too optimistic as to what can be achieved and the level of friendshoring or onshoring that we are actually going to be able to achieve in a short, even medium period of time, time horizon. And this is because the kind of dominance that China has developed is not only, and not even at all principally in the production, very upstream most stages, but mostly in the midstream segments, the processing, the refining, but also the industrial ecosystems built around critical minerals. And if we speak about rare earths element, the rare earths permanent magnets and associated EV battery, etc. chains. And this, we are talking here about a level of complexity, industrial policy, government, sort of strategic planning, decades in the making, that include even elements of, talent, availability of, engineers and so on, so many elements that are not really part of the discussion that make the problem a lot more complex, I think, than we tend to assume, especially perhaps in Canada, because we're a resource producer. We tend to think like, well, we can make this stuff, we'll solve the problem. But it's not exclusively a raw materials problem. It's a whole industrial ecosystem problem.
And I think we might want to come back to this odd tension that on the one hand, there's this sense of crisis, this sense of urgency that Heather was alluding to. But on the other hand, it's also industrial policy, thinking maybe 5, 10, 20 years ahead, what is feasible, what is not, where can we make progress quickly, where are we struggling? Maybe, Pascal, one thing that I think it was in a recent event that you did, you said something that really struck with me, that there was a game change moment in April of this year that really reinforced the sense of crisis. And so as we then try to better understand international supply chains of critical minerals, what has happened? Where are we now?
Yeah, so I mean, China had over the past few years unveiled a few measures, a few export restrictions that touched on various critical minerals. And this happened in 2023, two times in August 2022, December 2023, and another time in December 2024. And these were measures that, and I'm skipping over the 2010, rare earths Japan incident, because that was a little bit separate in my mind. But over the past 2-3 years, so yes, you see those export restrictions coming on, but they grab attention. They mostly have to do with niche materials, germanium, gallium, antimony, and the like. And they did result in some reflections, of course, a lot of headlines, but it didn't seem to sort of have the sort of impact at all that we've seen on April 4th. So what happened on April 4th is the Chinese government unveiled a new licensing regime that would target specifically heavy rare earths elements and associated technologies and magnets. And this licensing regime, I'd be happy to talk about this for hours, actually. With fellow China watchers, we have gone back and forth trying to sort of understand whether Chinese government really had a good idea of the sort of impact it would have. Because following these April 4th, announcements, the export, and China controls, I've mentioned, 90% of the processing of heavy rare earths, but also a bit less than 90% of processing now, more like maybe 80, but the magnets above 90%, well above 90%. And so the impact was felt. So what happened is now you need to register to get the license, and you need to provide information about end use, very detailed information about where this is going to go, with the intent, obviously, to sort of, so there could be multiple kinds of intents there, but certainly it gives the Chinese government a lot of visibility on end use, especially in the defense industry. But it also had the impact of creating a backlog of literally tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus applications, which the government was not prepared or not willing at different points between April and June, to process in a timely fashion. And there is where, it's unclear to me as to whether it was really the government was not quite prepared to deal with the amount of applications and the complexity of this process, or whether there was some slow walking at different points between different rounds of negotiations that ensued between the Chinese government and the US government thereafter. But all this to say that I think that the April 4th moment really ushered in a new era in the China-US sort of evolving relationship or rivalry. This was really a moment where, as Paul Triolo has put it in a webinar that I had the pleasure to share with him and Lizzie Lee, China from then on had clearly the capacity to shut down factories in the US, in Europe. And actually, we heard that Ford had to close the factory down. I mean, this is a whole new level of impact. And I think that it profoundly changed the tenor of US-China relations. And we saw the US government really scramble in the aftermath to reach some kind of preliminary agreement very early on in the late spring, early summer. So we're in a new world right now, and the level of awakening in the West to what this represents is.
I want to move on to Canada in a second, but I give the floor as well, Heather. And maybe because we've talked a lot about global supply chains and critical minerals, but also global value chain, that some of the downstream effects that are potentially important for Canada, including in the EV space. So maybe you can say a little bit about that before we move on to.
Yeah, and I will. And you haven't fully answered your first question either, of getting a sense of why rare earths and antimony and gallium and germanium are in this category, and a copper and nickel and aluminum would be in a different category. And one is very large markets. This is very large markets for copper and nickel, literally hundreds of years of international trade. They're too big to manipulate in some ways, or they're too big to monopolize. They've been manipulated, but they're too big to monopolize. And they're traded, and the market is fairly healthy. Even if China can manipulate a little bit, the market is very healthy in that buyers and sellers can find a price, and you can react to lower prices or higher prices, produce more, produce less, and find some way. The ones that China has put export restrictions on are these niche, we call them niche or lightly traded metals with very small markets. And that's why there's been no interest from the West, from big corporations in investing in these. The market for rare earths or for gallium or for germanium, but it might be low billions, like you can own the whole rare earth, production supply chain for $5 billion, if it was available for sale. And so when you're talking about germanium, and a lot of these things are byproducts of the things that do make money. So we talk about base metals, those things make money. These minerals are found in a similar deposit. Germanium is usually found beside zinc. But there was just no point processing it. It just became waste because there was such a small market. There was no value to Teck to process them in their waste because what they were making money off was zinc. But China found ways to make money off those byproducts because they had, lower costs and because they were strategic about it, they made it a point. And then it became very hard to compete. And in some of these very small, lightly traded byproduct categories, the market is so small and there's so few trade. There may only be a handful of producers and processors in the world, and most of those may be Chinese. And so there just was no way for any Western company to enter that market, that they were better at it. They had a longer experience with it. All of their suppliers knew them. They were doing it to specs that suppliers knew and understood. It's very high barrier of entry to a new market entrant, and no point for a market entrant. Like, stick with your copper and your gold and your zinc. There's not a lot of money to be had in those. And that's how we found ourselves in this situation, is that things that didn't make a lot of money. But, and I always say this, in my SUV, if the battery dies, it's only $200 to replace the battery, but the whole thing is worthless until I have a new battery. So it's a small part of the whole thing that, the amount of rare earths that goes into a car, the amount of I don't know what else that goes, molybdenum or whatever. It's a small amount, but it's essential. You can't do it without it. And that's where we've come in. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was an important question to answer, I think.
Yeah, in a way, and please move on, but makes it more difficult, but it makes it easier because, as some of you may have heard in the news, it's essentially bought recently an equity stake in a rare earth mine, I think in Arizona.
It's empty with your.
Yeah. So, of course, you cannot do the same thing with copper. There are other challenges there. There's no localization, there's market manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to process copper. Well, there are all these different economic differences that we have to keep in mind. But let's move on to Canada, because Canada, as I said initially, on the one hand, it's an opportunity, but it's so. Let's talk about the threat aspect first. And I think both of you, in both your comments and your writing, you've emphasized that we are in a new world, and things have changed dramatically over the past 2 years since the mineral strategy has been released. So, what does the picture look like for Canada when it comes to the threats? Is it a threat to our security? Is it a threat to our future prosperity because we so much catching up to do to be competitive in these value chains? Is it a threat to both, or to economic security, whatever that means? How can we let's characterize that threat, and then what should we be doing about it? Maybe
Well, I'll start by saying it's mostly opportunity, if you ask me. But we'll start with but we'll get to that. So to say what the threats are, we have the same security supply threats as everyone else. So obviously, we will never be able to produce and process all the things that we need for our industrial supply chain. It's even hard for the United States or China to do that. So no one can really do it, and especially a country the size of Canada. can't produce everything that it needs for its supply chain. So we have the same dependencies as everyone else. And because we have a smaller market, you know, we really have to work with others to figure out. So that's one thing. I think of interest for this discussion is the threat that we face from China on the market manipulation, because we are a major mining country. Get into, you know, all the ways I think that we are a major mining country, but I think, you know, we lead the world regularly in exploration spending. We have so many junior miners here. We have the TSX, which is the biggest financier of mining companies. And China has been a threat to that. And in fact, we have lost ranking and we have lost market share in the last 20, 30, 40 years, since the 1980s, probably, largely because of competition from China. And because we have, and you mentioned it when you know, we have a laissez-faire market system in Canada. And it was just, can you make money at a certain price or not? And if China was willing to help its producers or its supply chain without market incentives, there was just nothing was left for market, you know, for market players. You're just outcompeted. And so what we've seen, how we've been threatened in Canada, is the very easy way, first of all, to manipulate prices and either to lower them or increase them, depending on how you want to manipulate the market, make it easier or harder for particular projects to get off the ground, to have the right economics to get off the ground, or for mining companies. But also the irony, or you know, it was after the last commodity cycle boom, which ended in 2014, there was no money in junior mining, in exploration and mining. The only money was Chinese money. And they knew that, and they used that. And so we've had this catch-22. If you're in the mining sector, you don't want Chinese money, but there's no other source of money. So we have the Investment Canada Act, all those things that we discussed to protect us against Chinese investment, but nothing has filled the vacuum on the other side. And so it has been a real problem. And even for all junior miners, all miners, if you're a Rio Tinto or Teck or anyone, Vale, I mean, at some point, your supply is going into China. Maybe you're producing it here, it gets processed there. Maybe it gets processed there, but it turns into components here. You can't disentangle. So it's been very hard for mining companies to navigate political challenges and the need for, you know, the reliance on Chinese investment and Chinese purchasing of your good.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about some of the points of intervention that maybe inconsistently has undertaken, such as putting barriers on Chinese inward investment in critical minerals. We've also seen some trade restrictions, especially south of the border vis-a-vis China, to try to essentially decouple some of these markets and to create a bigger domestic market. Maybe Pascal, if we think about this market creation, how these different tools of intervention come in here, how can Canada work together with partners to counter some of these threats, and what are the instruments that at its disposal?
Yeah, so I would say that Canada is in a bit of a unique position. You know, we are an advanced economy, we're a G7 economy, but we are also a natural resource producer. And we are also, makes us even more unique, deeply integrated with the US economy. And this, in the current environment, creates a number of interesting policy challenges around the issue of critical minerals. And so we have, in some ways, to think about multiple issues at once that don't necessarily align. And this makes it perhaps, more of a challenge. But also, perhaps we can find opportunity in a way to turn every one of those angles into opportunities. But, in some ways, Canada faces similar problems than its G7 partners, and hence the G7 action plan that was announced in June this year around critical minerals, in that we want a reliable, resilient supply, and we face some of the same challenges that France or, Japan might. But we are also in a position where we can position ourselves to serve other countries' resilience objectives. And then the particular Canadian angle is that we're so in such a delicate position with regards to our U.S. relationship and the recent U.S. actions around deregulation of the mining ecosystem tempted, acceleration of the development sort of attempts by the current U.S. administration to speed things up in the mining industry might have second-order effects on the investment environment in Canada too. And so there are all these questions that we need to think about at the same time. Regarding your question, Wolfgang, and different tools, I think that some of what the international nature of these problems mean that we have to think about solutions in an international manner. And sometimes a discussion in each of those G7 countries, is a little bit too domestic. So there obviously is an enormous industrial policy and domestic policy agenda to work here. But issues of, you talk about market tools, so stockpiling, for example, initiatives, makes no sense whatsoever for each G7 country to stockpile the same thing, right? We're talking about, in some of these instances, minerals that are coming in small quantities. There are issues, for example, Heather mentioned price floors. Well, Canada can't do this alone, right? Because nobody can do this alone. Ideally, we would have these discussions, and the G7 did actually talk about these things, creating an environment where there is security in terms of demand horizon. And this has to do with the green shift. Now, there are difficulties south of the border because as much as the Trump administration is trying to deregulate, it's also endangering the sort of green agenda and EV agenda. So I'm just going to park this for a moment, but these market shaping solutions, in large part because of Canada's relatively small economic size, but also just by nature, because those markets are global, need to be plurilateral. So talking about any sort of market shaping tool, price floors, stabilization initiatives, demand horizons, any sort of attempt to shape global supply chains would ideally be done in a plurilateral forum. And the other thing I'd say about this is, yes, the G7 action plan was, good, and there's some good content in there. It was interesting that South Korea, was able to join, and I think so Australia was able to co-sign as well. India also was able to co-sign. So this is a good sign, but the critical mineral challenge won't be solved by the G7. And we broaden the discussion a little bit to include emerging markets. This is way too parochial of a discussion, and I would love Canada to, and I was happy to see that the Prime Minister met his Indonesian counterpart and signed the Indonesian economic, trade agreement. So we need Indonesia at the table. We need to engage with Brazil. We need to engage with way more broad of a community of partners than the G7 sort of traditional partners on this.
Yeah, we'll move on to the opportunities in just a second, and everybody can also start thinking about some of the question or comments that they have. We will soon turn it over to you. But maybe two things before we move on. The first thing is that, is this intermingling of these economic objectives and these economic security or national security objectives helping, or is it hindering some of this coalition building? I'm thinking particularly about relationships like Canada and Australia, where both are potentially countries that could provide some of these resources, but they're also competing. Many of the miners are obviously connected, but there might be an interest by the government to say, well, if we need more refining capabilities, let's do it in Australia rather than in Canada. So what's the competition angle? And to what extent are like-minded countries really like-minded when it comes to everything? And the other point that I would just wanted to get your views on, and that can lead to the opportunity. What about trying to decouple Western markets and some of those more China-dominated markets. There has been a lot of talk about standards and what are the opportunities that you might want to come back to. Of Canada is that it has a bit of a reputation of a sustainable miner. We are leading when it comes to engagement with indigenous parties. We are leading when it comes to environmentally friendly mining to the extent that's possible. So to what extent can we create these green markets that might then provide a bit of an insulation from pressures that will come from China? Maybe quick answers on those, and then we move on to the
quick answers.
Quick answers on this.
Yes. I'm happy to start.
Sure, go ahead.
So there are at least two questions in there. One on the, how we work with partners where, some of our interests may align and some of our interests may collide. Australia is a good example of that. And then the China question. So on the various kinds of interests, I would hope that we would be able to find the areas where collaboration is actually helpful for both. So take Australia as an example. The Australian government unveiled a 1.2 billion sort of stockpiling initiative. That's exactly the kind of thing that I could hope that Canada is already having discussions with our Australian counterparts on. The Australian government has indicated they would be happy to work with partners on something like this. There will be areas where Australia and Canada are in a competitive, sort of posture, but on the question of standards, on the question of so the sort of coordination challenges and some of the standardization challenges, the other types of resilience objectives of that sort, I would be shocked if we can't find some areas where we are fairly comfortable collaborating. And then, no matter how much we try to shape this environment, it will remain a firm-led, environment as well. And then there's a certain number of decisions. But so that's on the sort of partners, shared interest question. On the China question, I would just say that here we need to have more sophisticated reflection on what our resilience objectives are. I mentioned the European Union had, issued targets. We haven't done this in Canada. I suspect that if we try to realistically develop resilience objectives, China would remain part of the picture. So no matter how much we try, we have to develop a sort of definition of resilience. And that will also have to compose China remaining a major stakeholder. And I think that sometimes we focus very much on the how do we become resilient, but we forget that at the same time, China will continue to dominate in many cases, perhaps remain above 50% of refining and processing of many of the minerals we're talking about today. And how do we live with that? How do we think about that? What is a comfortable zone where we can, feel secure, but that nevertheless acknowledges that China remains a part of the picture, and that global, so sort of critical mineral supply chains being global are both an integral feature of commodity markets as they stand today, but also a feature of resilience. The fact that they are global is also a resilience feature, right? We don't want to onshore everything. That would be actually bad for resilience. So we have to sort of keep that in mind as we move ahead.
I'll treat your question as a buffet and I can choose what I want to answer. I'm just going to start with stockpiling. A lot of where we think the stockpiling, which some countries have done and some countries do, but the clearest success is obviously the International Energy Agency strategic reserves. And everyone in the IEA agreed after the energy crisis in the 70s that they would all hold 3 months worth of oil. But there are so many, it's very simplistic to say we should stockpile when it comes to critical minerals, because what phase of the mineral are you stockpiling it? It is no point stockpiling raw rare earths if you can't process it or turn it into magnets. Some of them are expensive to stockpile. Some of them have a shelf life, and you just can't stockpile it forever. So some things can be stockpiled, some things can't. There's limited store markets. And at some level strategically, you have to think, do we think the Chinese model is better? Do we think that provides better economic outcomes in the end? I can see how we're vulnerable to it, but I have to feel like the part of the solution is our strength of a free market and of the invisible hand and of letting supply and demand determine to some level what you have. And I'll turn to alliances. Very tricky in 2025 to know who to trust. And when we're talking about defense materials, and if push comes to shove, and there is a war in Europe, if there's a bigger war in Europe, if there's a war in the South China Sea, if there's a war somewhere, do we think the United States is going to share its rare earths if it needs it for a supply chain and vice versa? We just saw this with COVID and with vaccines. When push comes to shove, these things will not be shared. And so it's very hard to understand who to trust, who are your allies. And I think if you have the United States and India and Japan and the EU in the same tent, this is going to be very difficult for people to trust supply chains for the future. Now, then I'll finish with my, a more optimistic view, which is Australia, and trying to think through all these things. What is then the opportunity or the role for Canada? What can we do? And I think between Canada and Australia, it's almost good that we are, we don't really need each other. We don't import from each other because we produce the same things. The two of us get together and have like this benign resource hegemon. And we don't have to produce everything. We just have to produce enough of everything that China does not have. A market hegemony where it can manipulate prices. We just need that enough redundancy that they can't manipulate the way that they can right now. And we probably don't need it in everything. We are going to be globalized. It's very much a double-edged sword for China to put export restrictions on these things. Now the markets for antimony and tungsten and germanium and gallium are pretty healthy. And there's a lot of investment pouring into those. And if China carries on this way very much, there will be alternatives. There will be competitors for it. So it's tricky for it to put on these export restrictions because it's only so long until the West provides an alternate. But back to Australia, the two of us provide just enough of everything. And if they want to do rare earths, it costs money to do rare earths. So it's not going to make money, it's going to cost money. Let them cover rare earths. We'll do germanium, gallium, whatever it is. Let's cover off that NATO defense supply chain list. But between the two of us, and everyone trusts the two of us. And the other thing is because there's two of us, you don't have to trust Canada and you don't have to trust Australia. You just have to trust that one of us will provide it. And I just feel like it's going to be too hard in 2025 to negotiate amongst the G20. No one will ever trust each other. But Canada and Australia would do it because why would we do it? It'll cost us money, soft power for the influence. Answer foreign policy. How is NATO spending?
Mhm.
That's a very interesting proposal. I have to think about it some more. One of the risks, of course, is that we see a little bit of a fragmentation of different initiatives and partnerships. And so identifying who's your most reliable partner might be very good.
I just feel like don't trust the United States. Don't trust Europe. Don't trust. Let's make it so that no one has to trust anyone. All you have to know is that China or Canada or Australia are producing enough that we'll want it in the market.
All right, we will turn over to you in just a second. Let's finish on the other opportunities for Canada. We talked about Canada having all this expertise, having mining companies broad sustainability leadership. So where do you see Canada being the leader here in the space? What are the big opportunities here? And maybe we're talking a lot about the upstream and the midstream. Also, let's think a little bit about the downstream with lots of abundant clean energy. How is that with in the mix of opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say the G7 action plan actually touched on many of those things that Canada can lead on. And most obviously, I think for Canada, it's really, really important that we don't follow the lowest common denominator approach that the current US administration is taking with regards to regulatory constraints. I mean, we could open the sort of abundance, but let's not. But mostly in terms of the standards of community engagement and indigenous partnerships and import that we continue to have on the sort of elements of the green shift, et cetera. To me, these are, even if some people may argue that in this short term, I don't do this, but may argue that it sort of lengthens maybe regulatory approvals or et cetera. I think in the long term, it's a strength for Canada to continue in that direction. And the G7 action plan was pretty clear that the G7 partners considered the promotion of standards-based markets for critical mineral as a strength. And so that's one. I think there's a whole agenda as well in terms of transparency issues. So the coordination part, I think there's a lot that Canada could do pretty effectively. Sometimes those markets, you're right, they're very opaque, right? And so a certain level of information sharing among partners would go a long way. You know, to increase the resilience, sentiments of resilience. There's a whole bunch of issues around capital mobilization. So there's great language in the G7 statement around development finance institutions and identifying areas where there can be more partnerships in that area. And I think that you sort of touched on the more downstream, the supply chain. You know, there are opportunities. Canada is a resource power, but it's also an industrial power. And we have automobile ecosystems, aerospace ecosystems. And no, I would really hope to see investment in the innovation space where we can, you know, perhaps in the sort of at the technological frontier of points in the supply chain, in the value chain, you know, to sort of figure out ways to make certain kinds of batteries less reliant on certain kinds of minerals, for example. There's a whole bunch of innovation developments that Canada could be able to lead the way in. And the last thing that the G7 action plan mentions that I think is really important is the issue of shared prosperity with emerging markets and developing country partners. And so I think that there's also a role that Canada can play to sort of offer and approach the partnerships with resource producers outside of the West with a sort of shared prosperity and shared investment mindset rather than an extractive mindset. And I think Canada can also lead the way, should be better there. Two questions there.
I'll say two things. So everyone else, but we're really good at mining finance. And I think people, if you're not in resource sector or if you have kind of a superficial understanding, you just think it's, you know, digging rock. And it's a very sophisticated business. And Canada and Australia are very sophisticated at financing it. And why do you have to be good at financing it? First, you need the money, but you need to know what is a good project. And Canada and Australia and the people listed on the TSX and the ASX are very good at knowing what a good project is and then getting the finance for that and going ahead. Also very good at the engineering at it and very good with engineering schools, and not everyone has that. So if we could unleash our mining sector somehow and the finance, I think that would be, you know, I think that's a real strategic advantage that Canada and Australia together have. Junior miners in the world. That's through the TSX and the ASX. And I just want to highlight one on the kind of ESG or environmental side. First of all, almost every commodity Canada produces, we're in the top quartile of performance, ESG wise, whether it's GHG emissions, and that's usually because we have clean hydro for a lot of our things. It's the social conditions, all those things. If it's produced in Canada, I promise you, it's, you know, it meets your highest standards. But it's also important to appreciate what it looks like from a buyer's perspective that I've come to appreciate. If you're Volkswagen in Europe, and now you have all these restrictions on where you can source your materials, where it's processed, the GHG intensity, all of it. First of all, and you have to make more EVs, and you're getting killed by the Chinese EV market. That they are competing with you and they're winning. And what do? We're going to put more restrictions on your supply chain. We're going to make it harder for you to develop a solution. Now they're becoming very uncompetitive with Chinese competitors. So I don't think most, OEMs want more restrictions. I don't think putting more restrictions on Western OEMs is going to be the way that we win. Like, we have to be balancing the competitiveness of what we're doing. But like I say, if it comes from Canada, I promise you, you're like, that's all you need to know in a way.
We see that scaling back happening in Europe with deforestation regulation being postponed and due diligence also being watered down. So if you liked what you've heard tonight, I have good news for you, because both of them are prolific writers. So you'll find lots of other very in-depth material online. And of course, we are just at the beginning of this project. So hopefully stay tuned. More research is going to come out of this in related projects. For now, please join me in thanking our two excellent speakers.